The document hit the table like a gunshot. Grace Walker stared at the deed spread across the scarred wooden surface of the lawyer's office in Millhaven, Texas, her hands trembling so badly she had to press them flat against the paper just to read the words. The year was 1883. The dust outside was thick with August heat, and the man sitting across from her, Harlan Pruitt, attorney at law with his oiled mustache and his carefully neutral expression, was watching her the way a man watches a fire he has already decided not to put out. "Say that again," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Say exactly what you just told me." Pruitt cleared his throat. "Your father signed this deed over to a Bernard Reed approximately 7 months ago, Miss Walker. The transfer was legal and witnessed. The Reed property and your father's land are now, by all accounts, the same parcel, which means the ranch your father left you in his will is, technically, no longer his to leave." The betrayal hit her like ice water poured straight down her spine. She had traveled 3 days on a rattling stagecoach from San Antonio to bury her father and settle his affairs, as the telegram had coldly instructed her to do. She had packed her black dress and her grief and her careful composure, and she had told herself it would be a matter of a week, perhaps 2. Sign the papers, sell the property, return to the city, and begin whatever came next. She had not expected to arrive and find that the land she had grown up on, the land where her mother was buried under a cottonwood tree, the land that smelled of cedar and dry creek beds in her earliest memories, had already been quietly handed to a stranger named Bernard Reed before her father's body was even cold. Her father had been sick for a long time. She knew that. She had not been there for it, and the guilt of that knowledge sat in her chest like a stone she could not dislodge. She had been in San Antonio working as a school teacher, sending money home, writing letters that she told herself were enough. But they had not been enough. And now she was here, standing in the wreckage of whatever her father had done in his final months, staring at a deed that made a stranger the owner of everything she had ever called home. "Who is Bernard Reed?" she asked. Pruitt smoothed his mustache. "He is your father's neighbor, Miss Walker, has the adjacent property to the north. From what I understand, he helped your father considerably during his illness. Managed the cattle, kept the fences, brought supplies. A decent man by all accounts." "A decent man," she repeated, and the words tasted like ash. "A decent man who somehow ended up with my father's land." She picked up her bag, folded the copy of the deed that Pruitt had reluctantly provided, and walked out of the office into the blinding Texas sun. The street of Millhaven stretched before her, a general store, a livery, a saloon with its doors still swinging from whoever had just walked through them, a barber shop with a spinning pole, a church at the far end of the main road that looked like it needed fresh paint. The town was small and sun-beaten and alive with the particular kind of noise that frontier towns produced in August, the creak of wagon wheels, the call of a vendor, the distant low of cattle somewhere beyond the town's edges. Grace stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed. She had a hidden motive that she had not disclosed to Pruitt or to anyone. It was not purely about the land. It was about what was buried on that land, and she did not mean her mother. She meant the other thing, the thing her father had written to her about in his last letter, the letter she had received 2 weeks after the telegram informing her of his death, the letter he must have written knowing he was nearly out of time. She reached into her bag and touched the folded paper she had carried every mile of the journey here, its edges soft from how many times she had opened and closed it. Her father's handwriting had been shaky but deliberate. He had written, "Grace, there are things I need to tell you that I never found the courage to say aloud. Before I go, I buried something on the east side of the property, near the old split oak tree. You will know what it is when you find it. Do not let anyone stop you from finding it. I made mistakes. I hope this makes one of them right." She did not know what he had buried. She did not know what mistake he was referring to. But she knew that she needed to find it before she could settle anything, and she knew that to find it, she was going to have to walk onto land that a man named Bernard Reed now legally owned. She hired a horse from the livery, a sturdy chestnut mare named, according to the livery owner, Biscuit. She did not find this charming. She strapped her bag to the saddle, pulled her hat low against the sun, and rode the 3 miles north of Millhaven toward the Walker homestead. She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Cedar and dry grass and the faint sweet rot of summer, and beneath it all, the particular mineral scent of the creek that ran along the property's southern edge. Memory opened in her chest like a wound, wide and aching and completely unexpected, and she had to stop Biscuit at the top of the low rise that overlooked the property just to catch her breath. The house looked the same. 2 stories of weathered timber and white-painted trim that had gone to cream, a covered porch that wrapped around the front and east side, the big cedar tree her father had planted the year she was born standing now taller than the roofline. The barn was newer than she remembered, or perhaps had been repaired. The fences were clean and straight. Someone had been taking care of this place. She rode down the rise and through the gate, and before she had made it halfway up the path to the house, the front door opened. The man who stepped out onto the porch was not what she had been bracing herself for. She had been preparing for someone shifty, someone whose eyes moved the wrong way, someone who carried the look of a man who had maneuvered an elderly sick man out of his property through manipulation and hidden motive and carefully constructed traps. She had been ready to recognize corruption on sight. Bernard Reed was none of that. He was tall and broad-shouldered in the particular way of men who worked land for a living, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were the precise color of the creek in late afternoon light, a kind of gray-green that she registered and immediately decided was irrelevant. He wore a plain work shirt, suspenders, and boots worn down at the heels. He was holding a coffee cup in one hand and looking at her with an expression that was not unwelcoming but was very careful, the way a man looks at something he has been expecting and has not decided yet how to feel about. He looked to be in his early 30s, not ancient, not decrepit, a man in his working years. "Miss Walker," he said. It was not a question. She pulled Biscuit to a stop at the foot of the porch steps. "Mr. Reed," a pause stretched between them, taut as a fence wire. "Prout sent word you'd be coming," he said. "I have coffee on." "I am not here for coffee," she said. "I am here to understand how a deed my father signed while he was gravely ill became legal enough to override his will, and what you intend to do about it." Bernard Reed set his coffee cup down on the porch railing with a quiet, deliberate click. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said something she had not remotely expected. "I have been wondering the same thing." She blinked. "I beg your pardon. I did not ask your father to sign that deed over to me," he said. "I found out about it the same way you did, more or less, after he was gone. I have been trying to figure out how to reach you, and I have been talking to Prout about whether the transfer can be reversed." "Please," he said and gestured to the porch. "Come inside. There is a great deal to tell you, and the sun today is not forgiving." Grace Walker sat in her father's kitchen, in her father's chair, drinking coffee she had not wanted but now found herself grateful for, and listened to Bernard Reed explain the past 18 months of her father's life. It came out slowly, in the way that honest stories tend to, without the smooth polish of a prepared lie. Bernard had bought the neighboring property 2 years ago, he said, drawn by the price and the creek access and the quality of the grazing land. He had introduced himself to Thomas Walker, and found her father to be a sharp, sardonic man with a great love of argument and a great need of company. They had gotten along. Bernard had helped Thomas when the older man's health began declining in the winter of the previous year, helping to manage the cattle and the fences, and the supply runs into Millhaven, not out of any interest in the land, but because there had been no one else. "He talked about you constantly," Bernard said, and he said it simply, without reproach, though she felt the reproach anyway. "He was proud of you. He showed me every letter you sent." Grace looked at the table. "I should have come back sooner." He did not want you to, Bernard said. He told me so directly. He said you had built something good for yourself in San Antonio and he was not going to make you give it up to watch him diminish. Those were his words. Something about hearing her father's particular phrasing in a stranger's mouth undid a knot in her chest that she had been carrying for months. She pressed her lips together and forced herself to stay composed. "The deed," she said. "Tell me about the deed." Bernard leaned back in his chair. "In January, your father had a period of very poor health. A man named Calloway came around, a speculator from out of Austin, had been sniffing around this property and mine for a while. He had some scheme about the creek water rights, wanted to control the corridor between the two properties for some kind of cattle driving operation he was building. He came to your father when your father was at his lowest and he brought papers." Grace felt the trap close in the story even before Bernard reached the critical moment. "And my father signed. He signed something. Whether he understood fully what he was signing, I cannot say for certain. Calloway was persuasive. And your father's mind was clear, but his strength was not. And there is a way that a man like Calloway can make things seem simple when they are not." Bernard paused. "The deed that ended up recorded at the county office had my name on it rather than Calloway's. I think your father changed it deliberately or had Calloway change it. I think he trusted me more than he trusted Calloway and he was trying to protect the land from the speculator. But I never agreed to it and I do not want it." Grace stared at him. "You do not want the land." "I want my own land," Bernard said, "which I already have. And I want whatever your father intended for you to have, to go to you. That is why I have been in Prute's office twice this month already." The silence in the kitchen was different now. It was not the silence of adversaries. It was something more complicated than that. The silence of two people who had both been circling the same mystery from different directions and had just unexpectedly found each other in the middle. "There is something else," Grace said. She reached into her bag and set her father's last letter on the table between them. Bernard read it without touching it, leaning forward, his eyes moving across the page. When he looked up, his expression had shifted to something she could not entirely read, but it was not casual. "The split oak tree," he said. "You know it. Your father pointed it out to me once. It is on the east side, just past the old water trough near the creek bend." He paused. "He mentioned it to me close to the end. He said there was something he needed to make right. I did not press him on it." Grace stood up. "Then I would like to go look." They walked together through the late morning heat, across the yellow grass toward the eastern edge of the property where the creek bent south and the cottonwoods thickened, and the old split oak tree rose from the bank like something that had been standing there since before either of them existed. Grace had climbed that tree as a child. She had scraped her knees on its bark and learned the names of the constellations by lying in its roots and looking up and asking her father, who was a man who knew more than he showed. The ground near the base of the tree was undisturbed to the eye, but Bernard found it a slight irregularity in the earth, a patch that had been recently turned and tamped back down, hidden under a fall of dried leaves. He produced a short-handled spade from the barn without being asked and handed it to Grace, who appreciated the gesture without having words for it. She dug. A foot down, she hit wood. A small box cedar, sealed with a simple clasp. She lifted it out with both hands and sat back on the creek bank with it in her lap. And Bernard stood a few feet away, giving her the space of it without being asked to. Inside the box was a folded document, a leather pouch that clinked with coins, and a photograph. The document was a promissory note, dated 1871, signed by a man named Harold Bryce of Galveston. It was a debt acknowledgement for a sum of $400 owed to Thomas Walker, with interest, a debt that had apparently never been collected. A note in her father's hand clipped to it read, "This was never about the money. I was too proud. Find Bryce's daughter if you can. Her name is Clara. She should have had this long ago. The money in the pouch is hers." The photograph was small and faded, a portrait of a woman Grace did not recognize, young, perhaps 20, standing in front of what looked like a Galveston building. On the back in her father's hand, "Clara Bryce, 1871. I should have done better by her father. Grace sat with the box in her lap and felt the full weight of what her father had left unsaid for 12 years settle over her, and then settle into something she could work with, something concrete and actionable, which was always her natural orientation in the face of grief. He wanted me to find this woman and give her the money, she said. Bernard crouched down to look at the document she held out. He studied it carefully, the way a man studies something that has actual stakes. $400 with 12 years of interest is a significant sum, he said. Yes, Grace said, it is. Do you know anything about the Bryce family? Nothing, she said. But Galveston is not so large that a woman named Clara Bryce would be impossible to find if she is still there. Bernard looked at her with an expression that was starting to contain something she was not sure she could name. Respect, perhaps, or the beginning of it. You intend to do it. I intend to do everything on that list, Grace said. I came here to settle my father's affairs, all of them. The land, the deed, this. She gestured at the box. All of it. She stood up and dusted the earth from her skirt, and Bernard stood with her, and for a moment they were very close in the narrow shade of the split oak, and she was aware of him with an inconvenient sharpness that she immediately attributed to the emotional intensity of the morning and dismissed as irrelevant. It was not irrelevant, but she did not know that yet. The following days fell into a pattern that Grace had not anticipated. She was staying at the only boarding house in Millhaven, a clean but spare establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Hooper, who had an opinion about everything and expressed them all freely. But each morning Grace rode out to the ranch, because there were legitimate affairs to attend to the cattle, which still technically needed tending, the legal conversations with Prout, the inventory of her father's belongings, the slow and necessary work of understanding what her father's estate actually consisted of. Bernard was always there. He moved through the property with the ease of someone who had spent the better part of 2 years becoming familiar with every fence post and water trough, and he was useful in the particular way of men who have learned a place by working it rather than merely owning it. He told her which cattle were whose, explained the arrangement her father had made with a neighboring family named the Costellos about the shared east pasture, showed her the account book her father had kept with the meticulous precision of a man who had once been a schoolteacher himself. She had not known her father had been a schoolteacher. She was 30 years old and she had not known this. What else didn't I know about him? She asked on the third day, sitting at the kitchen table with the account book open. Bernard was standing at the stove, heating up the coffee they had both developed a ritual around, and he turned with a look that was thoughtful rather than guarded. He was a more complicated man than he let people see, he said. He had a great deal of regret about things he had not done. The Bryce business was one of them. There were others. Tell me, she said. He brought the coffee over and sat across from her. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar tree and the light shifted in the kitchen window, and Grace had the sudden, disorienting sensation of something settling around her like a garment she had not known she needed. Bernard told her about her father. He told her about the evenings they had spent on the porch talking, about Thomas Walker's opinions on the railroad and on territorial politics, and on the changing face of Texas since the war. He told her about how Thomas had talked about Grace with a mix of fierce pride and guilty sorrow, how he had blamed himself for the distance between them, how he had felt that his silence about his illness was a form of protection, but had come to understand in his final weeks that it had been a form of cowardice instead. He said you were the best thing he had ever made, Bernard said quietly. He said that exactly, those exact words. Grace pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling until she was sure she was not going to cry in front of a man she had known for 3 days. Then she looked back at him and said, "Thank you." "I did not do anything," Bernard said. "You were here with him," she said, "when I was not. That matters to me." Something moved across Bernard Reed's face, something quick and bright and immediately controlled, and he looked down at his coffee cup with the careful attention of a man who is deciding how to arrange his expression. She noticed. She filed it away. the legal situation untangled more quickly than either of them had feared. Prout, faced with Bernard's consistent refusal of the deed, and the evidence that Thomas Walker had not been of full strength when he signed it, and further persuaded by the fact that Calloway had failed to disclose the actual terms of the arrangement to the witnesses at the signing, agreed to begin the process of reverting the property back to the Walker estate. This process would take several weeks and required correspondence with the county office in Austin, but it was moving. Calloway, when confronted with this development through Prout, sent a letter that was threatening in tone but legally weak. He had no real claim on the Reed or Walker properties, and he knew it. His scheme had depended on controlling both parcels through a cooperative arrangement, and without Bernard's cooperation it fell apart. He was, Prout said with some satisfaction, a speculator without enough spine to actually follow through on his threats. Grace wrote back to Calloway herself. She had been a schoolteacher for 7 years, and she had a gift for communicating clearly. The letter she sent was 3 paragraphs long, completely civil and absolute in its message. She received no further correspondence from Austin. "You are not what I expected," Bernard said to her on the 6th evening, as they were sitting on the porch in the last of the daylight, watching the sky turn colors that had no business being as beautiful as they were. "What did you expect?" she asked. He considered it honestly, which she was already learning was his characteristic mode. "Someone angrier," he said. "Someone who had decided what she thought before she arrived and would not be moved." "I arrived very angry," she said. "I know. But you changed your mind when the facts warranted it." He turned to look at her. "Not everyone does that." "You were honest with me," she said. "When I expected to find someone who had taken advantage of a sick old man, you turned out to be someone who has been trying to undo the injustice since it happened. That is not a small thing." "The injustice was not mine," Bernard said, "but it was done on my behalf, even if without my consent. I felt responsible for it." "That is a very honorable position," she said. "It is just the right one," he said, and shrugged one shoulder with the particular self-effacing gesture of a man who does not take credit for basic decency, as though it were something extraordinary rather than expected. She found this absolutely maddening and enormously appealing in equal measure. On the 7th day, they rode together to find the Costello family. Because there was a fence dispute along the east pasture that Grace needed to resolve personally before the legal process with the property could be completed cleanly. The Costellos were a large and loud family, a husband and wife with 4 children ranging from toddler to near adult, who ran cattle and some sheep, and had a complicated history with the Walker property that involved 2 droughts, a shared water agreement, and one incident involving a runaway bull that everyone seemed to remember differently. Maria Costello, who was clearly the operational center of the family, shook Grace's hand with both of hers and said, "Your father was a good man, and I am very glad his daughter is here." Then she looked at Bernard and said, in a tone that contained approximately 17 layers of meaning, "And I see you brought Bernard." "Mr. Reed has been helping me understand the property situation," Grace said, with perfect composure. "Of course he has," said Maria Costello, in a tone that suggested she found this very funny for reasons Grace declined to examine. They resolved the fence situation over the Costello's kitchen table, because in the West all things of importance were resolved over someone's kitchen table. The East pasture arrangement was formalized in writing and witnessed by Maria and her eldest, a serious young man of 19, who signed his name with the deliberate care of someone newly grown into adulthood. Everyone shook hands. Maria fed them beef and cornbread and pie, and Grace found herself at a table surrounded by children and noise and the smell of good food, and something in her chest ached for reasons she could not immediately identify. On the ride home, the sun was low and red and the cicadas had started their evening conversation, and the horses moved at an easy walk because neither of them was in a hurry. "You love this land," Bernard said. "It was not a question." "I did not know how much until I came back," she said. "I had told myself I was over it, that the city was better, that I had outgrown this. She gestured at the flat golden expanse around them. I was wrong. What will you do when the legal situation is settled? He asked. She had been asking herself the same question in the small hours of the morning at Mrs. Hooper's boarding house, lying awake with the unfamiliar silence of a small town around her. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I had a job in San Antonio, a life there, friends, a routine. Those things can be rebuilt, Bernard said. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead at the darkening road, his profile quiet and concentrated. They can, she agreed. The silence between them was comfortable, which she noticed because silences between people who have only known each other a week are usually not comfortable. This one was, with the particular warmth of something that has been established more quickly than either party expected or has words for. Tell me about your dark past, she said, because she was a woman who asked direct questions and because the comfortable silence had made her reckless. He laughed, short and surprised, turning to look at her. My dark past. Everyone has one, she said. This is the frontier. The people without dark pasts are the exception. Mine is not very dark, he said, compared to most. I was born in Missouri. My father was a farmer. My mother was a farmer's wife. And I had two younger sisters who are both married now in Kansas. I came south because Missouri felt too small and too full of memory after the war. Not memory I'd made personally, but the kind that settles into a place and does not leave. I spent several years ranging, working other men's cattle, learning the land. I saved what I could, which was not much, and then I found this corner of Texas and it fit. That is not dark at all, she said. No, he agreed. I told you. Why did Missouri feel too full of memory after the war? A pause. My father had opinions that put him on the wrong side of his neighbors, Bernard said carefully. He believed men were men, regardless of their origins. In Missouri in the 1860s, that was a position that cost you. It cost him his friendship with most of the county and a great deal of his business. It did not break him, but it marked him, and it marked the place for me. I was glad to leave. Grace looked at him with new attention. He sounds like a good man. The best I have known, Bernard said simply. Until your father, I think. The compliment to her father hit her somewhere very tender, and she turned her face toward the last of the sunset to compose herself. Over the next week, the legal process advanced steadily, and the days took on a shape that Grace recognized was going to be painful to leave. She rose early and rode to the ranch. She and Bernard worked through her father's affairs with the methodical care of people who respect the weight of what they are doing. And in the afternoons, there were small domestic moments that accumulated like stones, building a wall she had not planned to construct. She mended a curtain in the parlor using thread she found in her mother's old sewing basket, and discovered a grief that had been waiting quietly in the bottom of the basket like a patient animal. Bernard found her sitting at the parlor window with the curtain in her hands and the thread untouched, and he sat down in the chair across from her without saying anything, which was exactly right. She told him about her mother then, which she had not planned to do. Her mother had died when Grace was 8, of a fever that the nearest doctor had been a day's ride away to treat. She had been a woman of enormous warmth and very specific opinions, who had taught Grace to read from a Bible and an almanac simultaneously, and had instilled in her a love of questions that had eventually led her to teaching. She would have liked you, Grace said, surprising herself. Bernard looked equally surprised but steadily so, the way he received most things. Why? Because you ask good questions, she said, and because you are honest. She valued honesty very highly. She always said that an honest man was rarer than gold and more useful. She sounds like she was remarkable, Bernard said. She was, Grace said. I was lucky to have her, even briefly. The next morning, Grace received a letter from San Antonio. It was from the school board, asking her to confirm her return date. She had now been in Millhaven for 12 days, and her position was technically being held for 2 more weeks before they would need to hire a replacement. She held the letter for a long time. Then she set it on the kitchen table and went to find Bernard, who was repairing a section of fence near the barn, and she said, "I need to talk to you about something." He set down his tools and gave her his full attention. This was another of his qualities she had catalogued without meaning to. When Bernard Reed looked at you, he actually looked at you with the focused interest of someone to whom people matter. "I have a decision to make," she said, "about whether to go back to San Antonio." His expression did not change, but something in his stillness changed. "And what is making the decision difficult?" he asked. "Several things," she said. "The ranch, the land, the fact that I am only now understanding how much of myself I left here when I went away." She paused. "And other things." She meant him. She did not say him because she was a woman who had been trained by a lifetime of careful self-containment to say what could be demonstrated rather than what was merely felt, but she meant him, and by the way something very slightly shifted in his expression, she thought he understood. "I cannot tell you what to do," he said. "But I can tell you that this land needs someone to care for it. Your father's cattle are good stock. The house is sound. The creek has run clean 2 years running. This is a good property, and it wants someone who loves it." A pause. "And I am not going anywhere." The last sentence was quiet and specific, and it was not about land. Grace Walker looked at Bernard Reed in the morning light by the barn fence, and she felt the future rearrange itself around her like furniture being moved into a better configuration. "I need to go to Galveston," she said, "to find Clara Bryce and give her what my father left her." "That has to happen before anything else is decided." Bernard nodded. "When do you want to leave?" She blinked. "You would come. You would go alone," he said, and the look he gave her was somewhere between incredulous and amused. "It is my errand," she said. "It is a long trip for a woman traveling alone," he said, "and Galveston is a city full of the particular kind of men who make long trips unpleasant. I would rather come." He paused. "If you want me to." She did. She was not going to pretend otherwise. "Yes," she said, "I want you to." They left 2 days later after arranging with the Costellos to keep an eye on the Walker cattle and leaving detailed instructions with Prout. The journey to Galveston by rail and stage was 2 days in each direction, which meant they would be gone close to a week. Mrs. Hooper, when Grace informed her of this, gave her a look of such comprehensive understanding that Grace felt her face go warm, which she acknowledged was ridiculous for a woman of 30. The train from the nearest rail town was modern and relatively comfortable, and the rhythm of it was conducive to the kind of conversation that doesn't happen when you are occupied with work. They talked for hours. She told him about her years in San Antonio, the children she had taught, the particular joy of watching a child understand something for the first time, the loneliness of the city that she had been telling herself was independence. He told her about the 2 years ranging cattle through South Texas, about a man named Josefino who had been his trail boss and his friend, and had taught him more about reading land and weather than anyone else, about the night a storm had come up on them near the Rio Grande and how they had ridden through it entirely by feel. "Were you ever afraid?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without the hedging that men typically employed when asked this question. "That night I was very afraid." Josefino was not, or if he was, he did not show it. But I was. The lightning was continuous and the horses were beside themselves, and I could not see more than 10 feet in any direction. I thought about dying that night in a way I had not before. What did you think about it?" He turned to look at her across the small table between their seats, and the afternoon light from the window caught the side of his face in a way that she registered as purely aesthetic and filed under irrelevant for the 14th time. "I thought that I had not done enough of what mattered yet," he said. "That I had kept too many things at a distance, that I had been careful in all the wrong ways." She felt the weight of his words settle over the space between them. "Did you change that after?" she asked. "I tried to," he said. "Buying the land was part of it, staying in one place. Letting things matter." He looked at her steadily. "I am still working on parts of it." Galveston in 1883 was a city of the sea, humid and salt-aired and commercially alive, with its wharves and its trading houses and its particular mix of cultures that the Gulf Coast produced. After 3 days in Millhaven and 2 weeks of Texas cedar scrub, the smell of the ocean was dizzying. Grace stood on the platform of the Galveston station and breathed salt air, and felt her lungs expand in a way they had not since she had arrived in Texas. Bernard stood beside her and looked at the city with the curious, attentive expression of a man who is storing information. "I have not been to the coast in many years," he said. "Neither have I," she said. They found lodgings at a respectable hotel, took separate rooms as a matter of obvious propriety, and began the process of locating Clara Bryce. This turned out to be easier than expected because Galveston was, in fact, a relatively small city when you knew what you were looking for, and the Bryce name had history there. The clerk at the local records office, a helpful young man with spectacular whiskers, pointed them toward a neighborhood on the south side of the city where a Clara Bryce, now Clara Merchant by marriage, was known to run a small laundry establishment. They found her the next morning. She was a woman in her early 30s, sturdy and self-possessed, with the look of someone who had built something from nothing and knew the precise value of everything she owned. She looked at Grace with the wariness of someone accustomed to complications. Grace introduced herself and explained briefly. She set the box on the counter between them. She placed the promissory note and the leather pouch on top of the box and said, "My father owed this to yours. He was too proud and too ashamed to pay it when he should have, and then too much time had passed and he did not know how to reach you. He wanted you to have it. He wanted me to tell you he was sorry." Clara Merchant looked at the note for a long time. Her hands moved to the pouch and then stopped without opening it. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set with a composure that Grace recognized as kinship. "My father spoke of your father," Clara said, "not with bitterness. That was the thing that always struck me. He never seemed bitter about the debt. He said Thomas Walker was a proud man and that pride had cost them both something." "That is exactly right," Grace said. Clara opened the pouch. She counted the contents with a practiced hand. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "This is more than the original debt." "My father specified interest," Grace said. "And the years?" Clara Merchant nodded slowly. She reached across the counter and clasped Grace's hand briefly but firmly with the strength of a working woman's grip. "Thank you," she said. "This matters, not just the money, the acknowledgement that he tried to make it right." "It was the last thing he did," Grace said. "He thought it was important." "It was," Clara said simply. They did not stay long. The transaction was complete in its meaning, and Clara Merchant was a woman with a business to run and a life to attend to. Grace shook her hand again at the door, and Bernard nodded his goodbye, and they walked out into the Galveston morning. On the street in the sea light, Grace stopped walking. She stood still on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the satisfaction of a thing completed, a thing her father had set in motion and she had carried to its conclusion. Bernard stopped beside her. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Better than all right." She looked at him. "He can rest now." Bernard's expression was very soft. "Yes," he said, "I think he can." They had one more day in Galveston before the return journey, and something shifted in the nature of the time between them now that the errand was completed. They were no longer operating under the forward-moving pressure of a task. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, open and unhurried, and they filled it the way people fill time when they are newly free of obligation, and also newly aware of each other in a way that has been building for weeks without being named. They walked along the wharves. Bernard bought her coffee from a vendor, and she teased him for choosing the most complicated order possible. They watched a schooner being unloaded, and he told her about the Pacific trade routes, and she told him about the map of the United States she had kept on her classroom wall, with all the territories she had wanted to visit marked in red ink. "Did you visit any of them?" he asked. "Almost none," she said. "Texas and San Antonio, and now here. Galveston is on your map, I hope." "In very large letters," she said, and he smiled, and it was the fullest smile she had seen on his face since she arrived, wide and unguarded and entirely wonderful, and she felt it somewhere in the region of her sternum like a physical thing. They ate dinner at a restaurant near the hotel, a real dinner with tablecloths and candles and a menu on a printed card, which felt excessive and also exactly right. They talked about everything and nothing, about the railroad and its politics, about her father's books and which ones she was going to keep, about Bernard's sisters in Kansas and whether he had ever thought of going back to Missouri. "I'm not going back," he said. "Texas is home now." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because it stopped feeling like a choice," he said. "It just is. The place where you are home stops being optional at some point. It becomes simply what is true." She looked at him across the candlelight and felt the full weight of what had happened over the past 2 weeks arrive in her chest all at once, not gradually, but completely, like a light turned on in a dark room. She had come here to settle her father's affairs. She had come here to close a chapter, to tie off the loose ends of a life that had moved away from this place over a decade ago. She had expected grief and paperwork and the long, quiet work of endings. Instead, she had found this. This man, this place, this version of herself that moved through the cedars and the creek light feeling more recognizable than the version she had cultivated in the city. This conversation that felt more real than most things she had experienced in years. She was afraid of it, which she recognized as evidence that it mattered. "Bernard," she said. He looked at her. "I am not going back to San Antonio," she said. "I am going to write to the school board tomorrow and tell them to find someone else." He was very still. "I am going to keep the ranch," she said, "and learn how to run it properly, which will require a great deal of help from people who know what they are doing, which at present means primarily you." A pause. "If that arrangement is acceptable to you." "The arrangement," he said carefully, watching her, "of helping you run the ranch." "To start," she said. The word "to start" arrived in the space between them and landed with exactly the weight she had intended. Something in Bernard Reed's expression became very direct. He had always been careful, she had noticed, careful with what he expressed, careful with the space between what he thought and what he said. But he looked at her now with the particular directness of a man who has decided to stop being careful about something. "Grace," he said. "Yes. I want to be clear about something," he said, "because I am not a man who does well with ambiguity when it involves something that matters to me." "Neither am I," she said. "Since the morning you rode up to that porch and told me you were not there for coffee," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, "I have been trying to maintain a proper professional conduct in the face of something that has not felt remotely professional." She felt warmth move through her from the center outward. "I noticed," she said. He leaned forward slightly across the table. "Is that something you want to address?" "Yes," she said. "I believe it is." In the candlelight of the Galveston restaurant, with the smell of the Gulf coming through the open windows and the sound of the city going about its evening business, Bernard Reed reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and Grace Walker turned her hand over and held on, and that was the beginning. The return journey to Millhaven was different from the outward one in the way that all journeys are different when the inner landscape has changed. They sat closer on the train. They talked differently, with the ease of people who have admitted something and no longer have to manage the weight of not admitting it. He pointed out features of the Texas landscape as they moved through it, and she told him what she remembered of the same landscape from childhood, and somewhere in the layering of his knowing and her remembering the place became doubly theirs, which was a kind of intimacy she had not anticipated finding in a conversation about creek beds and cedar groves. He held her hand on the stage, which was bouncy and dusty and not remotely conducive to romance, and the complete lack of romance in the setting made it feel more genuine than any candle-lit moment could have. When they arrived back in Millhaven, Mrs. Hooper looked at them both for approximately 3 seconds and then said without preamble, "Welcome back. Supper is in an hour and you both look like you need feeding." "Thank you, Mrs. Hooper," Grace said. "Don't thank me," Mrs. Hooper said. "Thank the chicken." Over the following weeks, the ranch settled into a new shape. The deed situation was formally resolved at the beginning of September, when the Austin office confirmed the reversion of the property to the Walker estate, and Grace signed the final paperwork that made her the sole legal owner of the Walker Ranch and its adjoining creek rights. Calloway made one final attempt to intervene through a letter to Prout, which Prout handled with the weary efficiency of a man who has seen this particular type of bad faith before. It came to nothing. Calloway moved on to other schemes elsewhere, which was the way of speculators, and they did not hear from him again. Bernard and Grace worked the ranch together through the fall, the best ranching season in Texas, when the heat broke and the grass was still good, and the cattle put on weight comfortably. He taught her what she did not know, which was considerable, and she learned with the precise attention of a former schoolteacher who was accustomed to understanding systems. She taught him, in return, the accounting methods she had developed over years of managing a teacher's salary, and he applied them to the ranch's books with the focus of a man who had been running cattle by instinct rather than record. They fell into the rhythm of the land together, which is a different thing from falling into the rhythm of a city. On the ranch, the rhythm is set by light and weather and the particular needs of animals, and it requires you to be present in a way that most other lives do not. Grace had spent a decade being present to other people's children, which had been meaningful, but this was a different kind of presence, rooted in the place itself, in the cedar smell and the creek sound and the particular way the sky over the east pasture looked in the hour before sunrise when the stars were still visible and the first birds were just beginning. She wrote to her colleagues in San Antonio. She wrote to the school board. She wrote to the two friends she had made there, real friends, the kind that survive a great distance with proper tending, and she told them honestly what had happened, that she had come to end something and found she was beginning instead. One friend wrote back and said, "This is either very wise or very reckless, and from what I know of you, it is probably both." She thought about that for a long time, sitting on the porch in the evenings with Bernard, and decided it was the most accurate thing anyone had said about her in years. In October, on a Sunday afternoon when the weather was so perfect, it seemed almost like a deliberate argument for the existence of Grace. Bernard said something that he had been working up to for several weeks. She could see it in the way he kept starting sentences and then redirecting them, and she found it both touching and slightly amusing because she had assumed he was not a man who lost his nerve easily. They were on the porch, the light dying slow and orange over the cedars, and he turned to her and said, with the careful directness of a man who has decided to simply say the thing, "I would like to court you properly." She looked at him. "You have been courting me," she said, "since Galveston at minimum." "Informally," he said, "I would like to do it properly, with whatever your expectations are for what that means." Grace considered him carefully. "My expectations," she said, "are that the man in question is honest with me about his intentions, is consistent in his attentions, and does not make me feel that his interest is conditional on me being someone other than who I am." "Those are reasonable expectations," Bernard said. "I can meet all three." "I know," she said. "That is why I am saying yes." The fall passed in the golden, specific happiness of two people discovering each other while building something real at the same time. They rode the fences together in the cool mornings, repaired the section of the east pasture that had been weakened by summer flooding, negotiated a revised arrangement with the Costellos that was better for both parties, and began planning the expansion of the herd that would make the ranch genuinely productive rather than merely subsisting. Maria Costello, who had appointed herself a kind of benevolent overseer of the entire situation, invited them to Sunday dinner on 3 separate occasions in October, and each time made absolutely no attempt to pretend that the dinner was about anything other than looking at them together with manifest satisfaction. Her husband, a quiet man named Esteban who communicated primarily through dry one-liners, told Bernard on the second occasion that he was very glad someone was finally making use of the Walker place, and then looked at Grace and added, "And very glad someone is finally making use of Bernard." Bernard's expression at this was a study in composed dignity in the face of complete ambush. Grace laughed for a long time. There was a morning in November when she found a bundle of letters in the bottom of her father's desk, letters written in a hand she did not recognize, and upon reading them discovered that her father had maintained a lengthy correspondence with the local schoolteacher in Millhaven, the current teacher. It turned out, a man named Harris, who had apparently discussed books and territorial politics with Thomas Walker every week for 3 years. She went to find Harris, who was a narrow-faced, enthusiastic young man of 25 who was visibly overcome to learn of Thomas Walker's death and had assumed he had simply stopped writing. This untied another knot. She spent an afternoon with Harris going through the correspondence and understanding that her father in his final years had built more of a life in Millhaven than she had realized. He had been known and valued here. He had not been lonely in the way she had feared. The knowledge rearranged her grief into something she could carry differently, lighter and more loving. She told Bernard about it that evening, and he listened the way he always listened, with the full weight of his attention, and then he said, "Your father knew how to make a place into a home. You are very like him in that." "Is that a compliment?" she asked. "It is the highest one I know how to give," he said. By December, everyone in Millhaven understood what was happening between Grace Walker and Bernard Reed, because Millhaven was the size of a town where that kind of thing was simply known. Mrs. Hooper had opinions, which she expressed. Prout had fewer opinions but more legal paperwork ready, because he was a practical man. The Costellos had dinner plans. Harris, the schoolteacher, asked Grace if she would consider giving a talk to his students about San Antonio, which she agreed to on the condition that he would share her father's letters with her when she was ready to read them all. On a cold December evening, with a fire going in the Walker Ranch's fireplace and 2 cups of tea going cold on the table because they had gotten distracted talking about constellations and whether the view from the east pasture was better than the view from the porch, Bernard asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. He simply said, quietly and directly, in the middle of a sentence about the winter Pleiades, "I want to marry you, Grace, if you will have me." Not because of the ranch, or the legal situation, or any practical reason. Because I have not been this certain about anything since I decided to plant roots in this place, and I have come to believe that those 2 decisions, the land and you, were the same decision. This is where I am meant to be, and I think you are too. Grace Walker looked at Bernard Reed in the firelight and felt the particular piece of a thing that is exactly right, not perfect, not without uncertainty, but right in the deep structural way that matters. The way her mother's sewing basket in its exact spot on the shelf was right. The way the creak sounded in the evening was right. The way coming home was right. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." She had come here to settle things. She had not planned on finding something that made settling feel like the most exciting choice she had ever made. The wedding was small, because they both agreed that a large wedding was more ceremony than substance, and that substance was what they cared about. It was held on a Saturday in late January of 1884 at the Millhaven Church, which had received its new coat of white paint in December and looked appropriately crisp against the gray winter sky. The minister was a practical, kind man named Reverend Dawes, who had conducted approximately 400 weddings in his career and treated each one with the same focused sincerity. Maria Costello wore her best dress, brought her entire family, and cried starting approximately at the word dearly. Esteban Costello patted Bernard on the back beforehand in a way that communicated something significant in very few words. Mrs. Hooper arrived early and arranged flowers on the altar that nobody had asked her to arrange, and they were better for it. Harris, the schoolteacher, stood in the back and beamed with the particular joy of a bookish young man at a good love story. Grace wore a dress she had ordered from San Antonio, cream with a sage green sash, because she had decided that black was not the appropriate color for a day that was about beginning rather than ending. She carried her mother's Bible and a small bunch of winter rosemary that Bernard had brought in from the garden. When she came down the aisle of the little church and saw him standing at the front clean-shaven, in a dark coat that fit him properly for once, his gray-green eyes steady on her with the focused warmth that she had come to understand, was simply how he looked at her. She felt no doubt and no fear, only the clear, clean certainty of a woman who knows exactly what she is choosing. They said their vows with the careful attention of people who mean every word they are saying. When it was done, and Reverend Dawes had finished his conclusion, Bernard kissed her once firmly, and she heard Maria Costello make a sound somewhere behind them that was half sob and half cheer, and she felt the assembled small community of Millhaven settle around them like something warm. The first year of their marriage was the most productive year the Walker Ranch had seen in a decade. This was partly because Grace proved to have a substantial talent for the financial and logistical side of cattle ranching, which freed Bernard to focus on the operational and physical aspects, and the combination made them more effective than either had been separately. They expanded the herd, repaired the upper section of the barn, and added a small chicken operation at Grace's insistence because, she said, she was not going to spend another winter buying eggs when the means of production were entirely manageable. Bernard built a new desk for the parlor, because he was a man who showed love through building things, and Grace installed her father's books on the shelves of the room they had converted to a small library and reading room, which became her favorite place in the house, and eventually his as well. In the spring of 1884, Prout mentioned almost in passing that a schoolteacher was needed in Millhaven, because Harris had accepted a position at a university in Austin and was leaving at the end of the term. Grace spent 2 weeks thinking about this before mentioning it to Bernard, and when she mentioned it, he said, immediately and without any hesitation, "You should do it." "It would take time from the ranch," she said. "The ranch runs," he said. "It can run a few more hours on its own each day. And you were a school teacher. You are still one whether you are standing in front of children or not. You miss it." She had not said she missed it. She had not needed to. "Are you sure?" she said. "Grace," he said, with the patience of a man who has said someone's name a particular way many times, "I married you in full understanding that you are more than one thing at once. I do not require you to be less." She accepted the position. She taught at the Millhaven School for 2 years, the first woman to do so in the town's history, which produced some initial resistance from 3 members of the school board that she dismantled with the calm efficiency of a woman who has argued with Callaway's lawyers. By the end of her first term, the resistance had largely evaporated, replaced by the grudging respect that competence tends to produce eventually. The children were wonderful. They were the particular combination of rough-edged and earnest that frontier children tend to be, and they were curious in the unfiltered way of children who have not yet learned to perform indifference. She taught them reading and arithmetic and some geography and a great deal of logic, which she considered the most essential subject regardless of what the curriculum said. She brought them to the ranch twice and showed them the cattle and the creek, and explained how the water rights worked and why the quality of the creek grass mattered, and how a promissory note was different from a loan, because she believed that the boundary between school and the actual functioning world should be permeable. Bernard, who was enlisted to explain the cattle side of things on one of these visits, proved to be an excellent teacher without having any formal training in it, patient and specific and genuinely interested in the children's questions. Grace watched him from the fence while he crouched down to show a small girl of about 7 how to identify a healthy hoof, and felt such a sharp and wordless love for him that she had to turn away and pretend to be looking at something across the pasture. 15 months into their marriage, on a September morning that had the particular quality of early autumn in Texas, Grace told Bernard that she was expecting. He went very still in the way he did when something important arrived, that particular quality of controlled attention that she had learned to read as his deepest state of care. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that she had no adequate word for except full, like a vessel filled to the edge with something that needed no name. "Are you well?" was the first thing he asked, because he was that kind of man. "Very well," she said. "Happy, actually. Surprised at how happy." "I am not surprised," he said, and he kissed her forehead and then just held her in the kitchen for a long while, with the cedar tree visible through the window and the creek audible in the distance. And she thought about the box she had dug up from the east side of the property, and the letter her father had written, and the strange and specific gift of being sent somewhere to end things and finding instead that everything was beginning. Their son was born in the spring of 1885, in the bedroom of the Walker Ranch that had been Thomas Walker's, with Mrs. Hooper in attendance and Maria Costello in the kitchen making enough food to feed a cattle drive. He was a healthy, loud, thoroughly opinionated baby who arrived in the world with the look of a person who had already decided on several things. They named him Thomas, for her father, Thomas Bernard Reed, whose middle name was for the man who had showed up at a porch railing with a coffee cup and the particular courage of a man who decides to simply tell the truth. Mrs. Hooper declared him a perfect specimen of humanity, which was high praise from a woman who had opinions about everything. Maria Costello cried in the kitchen, because Maria Costello cried at all important events, which Grace had come to find deeply reassuring as a feature of the world. Esteban Costello said Thomas had the Walker look around the eyes, which was true, and it made Grace close those eyes briefly and feel her father very near for a moment, in the way that the dead sometimes arrive in the faces of the new. Bernard held his son for the first time with the focused, wondering care of a man encountering something so important he has stopped breathing for a moment, and Grace watched them together and thought, there it is. There is the thing he was waiting to have. There is the life that fits him. In 1886, she received a letter from Clara Merchant in Galveston. It was short, written in a clear and practical hand, saying that she had used the money from the promissory settlement to purchase the building her laundry occupied, that the business was now solidly established, and that she had wanted Grace to know because she felt Grace's father would have liked to hear it. She also said that her own daughter, now 3 years old, was named after her grandmother, and that the women of their two families had made a kind of peace that she hoped would last. Grace read this letter at the kitchen table in the morning, with Thomas asleep in the next room and Bernard outside beginning his day, and she held the page for a long time with something in her chest that was warm and whole and resolved, the satisfaction of a thing fully done. Her father's affairs were settled. All of them, the formal ones and the informal ones, the legal and the human and the deeply private ones. Everything he had left unfinished she had finished. Everything he had left wrong she had made right. She went outside and found Bernard at the fence by the barn, and she slipped her hand into his without explanation, and he looked at the horizon and then at her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the morning light with the ranch around them and the creek somewhere below making its perpetual patient sound. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Thomas learned to walk in the autumn of his first year, with the particular lurching determination of a boy who has decided the distance between furniture items is a challenge to be solved rather than an obstacle to be respected. He had Grace's precision and Bernard's stubbornness, which was both a reassuring combination and a slightly alarming one, and he grew into a child of enormous curiosity and a very high tolerance for being outdoors in all weather. He began accompanying Bernard on the morning rounds of the fence lines at an age when most children were still primarily concerned with food and naps, perched on the saddle in front of his father, who narrated everything with the patient specificity of a man who believed that a child's questions were always worth answering completely. Grace could hear them sometimes from the porch, Bernard's low voice explaining something about the cattle or the creek, or the particular behavior of the morning birds, Thomas asking the kinds of questions that began with, "But why?" and did not end. In the winter of 1887, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This news arrived with slightly less shock than the first time and considerably more practical planning, since they had now done this once and had a better understanding of what they needed. Mrs. Hooper, informed, said, "About time," and began knitting immediately. Their daughter arrived in July of 1887, in the heat of a Texas summer, with significantly more opinions about her arrival than Thomas had had about his. She was a round, determined, copper-haired baby girl who they named Margaret, for Grace's mother, Margaret Alice Reed, who grew up to be the most independent creature the Walker Ranch had ever produced, and who at the age of 3 climbed the cedar tree in the front yard and could not be persuaded to come down for 40 minutes. Grace sat at the base of the cedar tree waiting her out with a patience that was entirely sincere rather than performed, and called up, "Margaret, you can come down when you are ready." And Bernard came around the side of the house, took in the scene, looked up at his daughter and said, "She is going to be exactly like you." "Yes," Grace said with profound satisfaction. "She is." The Millhaven school grew in those years, as the town itself grew slowly, the way frontier towns grew when the railroad made things more accessible, and the land proved its fertility over time. Grace continued to teach until Margaret was old enough to be at school herself, which was the point at which the school gained both an additional student and a parent, who was by then the most influential voice on the school board. Harris came back through Millhaven in 1889 on his way to somewhere further west, and spent 3 days with them discussing books and Texas politics, and told Grace over dinner that what she had done with the school in 5 years was more significant than most things he had seen in frontier education. "I had good material to work with," Grace said. "You had children and a room," Harris said. "That is all anyone starts with." Bernard, who had been listening from across the table with the quiet attentiveness he brought to all conversations he considered important, raised his coffee cup in something that was not quite a toast, but was in the direction of one. Harris raised his in return. Grace looked at both of them and felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who has built something that holds. In 1890, they repaired and expanded the farmhouse, adding a proper second-story bedroom for the children, a better organized kitchen, and a full covered porch on the back of the house that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that became Grace's favorite place on the property. She kept her father's desk in the parlor and his books on the shelves, and his Bible on the side table where he had always kept it. Because some things you keep not out of inability to let go, but out of recognition that they are part of what makes a place a home. She walked to the split oak tree sometimes, alone or with Bernard, and stood in its shade and felt the full arc of what had happened. The woman who had arrived here with grief and suspicion and a determination to close something, and had been opened instead. Her father had sent her here to settle things, and she had settled them all, every single one, but the settling had been an opening, not a closing, a door she had walked through rather than a door she had shut behind her. She stood at the creek bend one early morning, the October light specific and golden through the cottonwoods, and she understood something that had been forming for years in the deep, slow way that real understandings form. Her father had known. Not all of it, not the particulars, not Bernard, not this exact life. But he had known that she needed to come back to this place, and he had made sure she would, not just with the practical necessity of the affairs to settle, but with the letter, the box, the mystery that would require her to stay long enough to find herself here. He had been matchmaking not with a man but with a place, sending her back to the ground of herself, and the man had arrived as a consequence of that ground being real and her being willing to stand on it. She walked back to the house through the morning grass and found Bernard on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and Thomas beside him with a notebook, drawing what appeared to be a map of the property in the practiced, serious way he approached all documentation. "Good morning," Bernard said. "Good morning," she said, and took the coffee cup and sat down and looked at Thomas's map and the cedar tree in the morning light and the flat golden distance of the Texas prairie, and felt the precise, full, unlost feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Her father's affairs were settled. Every one of them. The deed had been rightful for 7 years. The debt to Clara Bryce had been paid. The correspondence with Harris had been honored. The land had been kept and was thriving. The cattle were good stock and the creek ran clear. Her mother's grave under the cottonwood had flowers on it in every season because Grace maintained them without being asked or asking herself why, because some tending is simply love in its most plain form. And she had not just settled her father's affairs. She had settled herself. On a spring evening in 1891, Grace and Bernard sat on the back porch watching the east sky go dark in the particular sequence that the Texas spring performed, blue to green to the deep purple-gray that preceded full dark and the stars. Thomas was inside with a book. Margaret was asleep in the kind of dramatic total abandonment that small children bring to sleep. The house behind them was warm with lamplight and the smell of the supper they had eaten together, the 4 of them, at the kitchen table. Bernard had his hand around hers on the arm of the chair. He was looking at the sky with the steady attention of a man who never stopped finding the sky worth looking at, which she had always considered one of his finest qualities. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. In the last of the daylight, his face was familiar in the way that the best and most beloved things become familiar, not tired, not taken for granted, but known the way you know the weight of something you are grateful to hold. "That I am glad you came," he said. "That I am glad you stayed." She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had stood on a porch with a coffee cup and told her the truth when he could have lied, who had walked with her to a tree on the east side of the property and stood back while she opened something buried, who had ridden with her to Galveston to return what was owed and shared a dinner table in candlelight and held her hand on a dusty stage, who had asked her to marry him in the middle of a sentence about stars and meant every word. "I came to settle things," she said. "I did not expect to find that settling was a beginning." "Most things are," Bernard said, "the ones that matter." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the stars came out one by one over the Walker Ranch, and the creek made its sound in the distance, and somewhere a night bird said its piece to the evening, and the world was exactly what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.